One of the most misunderstood responses to pain, particularly deep, unresolved emotional pain, is hyperindependence. And I don't mean the healthy kind of autonomy that comes from competence or maturity. I mean the compulsive refusal to depend on anyone for anything. The kind of independence that masquerades as strength but is, in truth, a survival mechanism crafted in the fires of betrayal, abandonment, or chronic disappointment. It's a psychological shield, a fortress built to prevent further harm. Now, that kind of independence is not born in peace. It's forged in chaos. People don't wake up one morning and say, "I'll never rely on anyone again," out of joy. They arrive at that conclusion because they did rely on someone, and that reliance ended in pain. Maybe they trusted a caregiver who failed them repeatedly, or they loved someone who manipulated their vulnerability. Maybe they simply grew up in an environment where emotional needs were never acknowledged, let alone met, and so they learn a grim lesson. Dependency is dangerous. What you'll often see is a kind of quiet rigidity. These individuals will shoulder burdens alone. They'll downplay their struggles. They'll avoid asking for help even when it's desperately needed. They believe that needing others is weakness, and that weakness is punishable, sometimes by abandonment, sometimes by humiliation, but always by pain. So they become self-sufficient to the extreme, and they tie their worth to their ability to handle everything on their own. And here's the paradox. On the surface, these people appear strong, capable, composed, and control. They're the ones others lean on in a crisis, the ones who seem to have it all together. But beneath that composed exterior, there's often a well of unresolved hurt. There's anxiety, there's fear, there's grief. Because independence in this form is reactive. It's not the result of growth, but the residue of trauma. And unresolved trauma doesn't disappear. It reconfigures how you relate to others, and even to yourself. We have this cultural obsession with the strong, silent type. We admire the lone wolf. We romanticize solitude as though self-reliance were the ultimate virtue. But we need to be honest about the psychological toll of that posture. Human beings are social creatures. We're wired for connection. When someone withdraws completely into themselves and treats vulnerability as a liability, they're not thriving, they're surviving. And what happens over time is emotional isolation. Deeply hurt individuals who rely only on themselves become emotionally distant, not only from others, but from their own inner world. They suppress needs, they minimize feelings. They lose touch with joy because they're so preoccupied with avoiding pain. And the saddest part is that many of them don't even realize they're doing it. They just think this is what strength feels like, cold, lonely, and exhausted. There's a philosophical dimension here as well. Friedrich Nietzsche talked about the will to power, not as a domination over others, but as the ability to master oneself. But when your version of mastery is founded on a refusal to be vulnerable, you're not free. You're enslaved to your fear. True strength, philosophically and psychologically, is the capacity to be open, to risk connection even when you know the cost. That takes courage, that takes wisdom, that takes healing. Now, this doesn't mean we ought to swing to the opposite extreme and abandon personal responsibility or boundaries. Not at all. In fact, healthy independence is essential. But there's a distinction between being independent and being disconnected, between choosing solitude and being exiled by your own fear. Independence isn't a sign of emotional intelligence. It's a trauma response that says, I'd rather suffer alone than be betrayed again. And that's tragic. Because the very thing that would help them heal, a safe connection, is the thing they're least willing to risk. So they stay locked in a pattern. The walls they build to keep pain out become the same walls that keep love out too. And the longer they live like that, the more convinced they become that no one can ever truly be trusted. So how do we break the cycle? First, it requires awareness. You can't fix a pattern you don't even recognize. You have to be willing to ask, am I pushing people away because I'm strong or because I'm scared? Am I rejecting support because I don't need it or because I don't believe I deserve it? Those are hard questions. Necessary ones. Second, it demands gradual, voluntary exposure to trust. You don't go from isolation to intimacy overnight. You take small steps. You let someone in a little. You test the waters. And yes, it's uncomfortable, but discomfort is not danger. That's the distinction trauma often blurs. We confuse the anxiety of vulnerability with the reality of threat. But growth requires discomfort, and connection requires risk. Finally, it means learning to separate past from present. The people who hurt you before are not necessarily the people in front of you now. You are not powerless anymore. You can choose. You can discern. You can build relationships from a place of strength, not fear. And that's what it means to truly reclaim your power. So if you recognize yourself in this, if you've made strength out of silence, self-sufficiency out of fear, just know this. You weren't weak for needing others. You were hurt. And now you have the chance to heal. But healing won't come through isolation. It will come through courage. The courage to be seen, to be supported, and to be soft again, even just a little. Because true power is not never needing anyone. True power is knowing you could walk alone and choosing not to. Emotional reactivity is often misunderstood. People assume that someone who's emotionally reactive is simply passionate or sensitive or just wired that way. But if you take a closer look, if you examine the architecture of that kind of volatility, you begin to see that it's not just temperament. It's not merely about strong feelings. It's about wounds, old wounds, unhealed ones. Wounds that, when triggered, flood the nervous system and hijack the present moment. And here's the crux of it. When someone overreacts, especially to something seemingly minor, it's not the present they're reacting to. It's the past, revived, reactivated, relived in real time. That sharp tone someone used with them, it wasn't just annoying. It was a mirror reflecting a childhood memory of being constantly criticized. That friend who forgot to text back. It wasn't just inconsiderate. It echoed a pattern of being ignored or abandoned when they needed connection most. The present moment becomes symbolic, but stand in for unresolved pain. This isn't always visible to the outside observer. Often the response seems disproportionate, confusing. But that's only because the response is calibrated not to this situation, but to an entire history. And if we don't confront that history, if we don't bring it into conscious awareness, it continues to govern us from the shadows. What happens in these moments is a kind of psychological time travel. The body responds with intensity because it's been trained to anticipate pain. It's an act of self-protection. But protection in this context can look a lot like aggression, or shutdown, or sarcasm, or withdrawal. And when these patterns repeat themselves, especially in intimate relationships, they generate conflict, mistrust, and eventually distance. Now, here's a deeper point. The emotional reactivity is not just a personal issue. It's also existential. Because to be ruled by your reactivity is, in a sense, to forfeit agency. It's to become a puppet of your past. The Stoics knew this well. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." But emotional reactivity flips that on its head. It hands your emotional state to circumstances, to people, to history. And that's not strength. That's slavery, psychological slavery to what you haven't healed. So what do we do about it? The first move is awareness. You have to notice the path. You have to be willing to pause, to reflect, and to ask, what exactly am I reacting to? Not just what was said, but what it means to me. Why does this feel familiar? Why is it so intense? If you dig into that space with honest curiosity, you'll often find that the emotional storm has roots far deeper than the current weather. And when you begin to understand the pattern, you regain a measure of freedom. You realize you have a choice. You're not just reacting blindly. You can respond deliberately. That's a powerful psychological shift. You move from victimhood to sovereignty. You stop being driven by the emotional residue of old injuries, and you begin to write a new narrative. Now, let's not be naive. This isn't easy. It takes work. It takes brutal honesty. It may even require the guidance of a therapist or mentor, someone who can help you see what you've become blind to. But the reward is immense, because when you're no longer ruled by your reactivity, you can actually engage with life. You can listen, not just defend. You can love, not just guard. You can learn, not just react. There's also a profound philosophical component here. Carl Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Emotional reactivity is a symptom of unconscious material taking control. The more unaware you are of what shaped you, the more likely you are to repeat it. But the moment you name it, the moment you bring that buried emotion into the light, you create the possibility of transformation. Not just suppression, but integration. And that's the goal. To become cold or detached or unfeeling, but to become integrated, to be able to feel deeply without being controlled by those feelings. To acknowledge the pain without becoming consumed by it, that's maturity. That's resilience. That's real strength. When you think about it, emotional reactivity is not your enemy. It's a signal. It's a flare from your psyche saying, there's something here you haven't resolved. And if you ignore it, it festers. But if you face it, it becomes fuel for growth. You turn pain into wisdom, hurt into insight. You stop merely surviving and start living with intention. So the next time you feel that surge, the heat in your chest, the racing thoughts, the urge to lash out or shut down, take a breath, step back, ask yourself not just what's happening, but what's really being touched. Because the power lies not in suppressing the reaction, but in understanding it, owning it, transcending it. Emotional reactivity doesn't mean you're weak. It means there's a wound worth healing. And the moment you stop reacting and start reflecting, you begin the process of becoming whole. There's something profoundly revealing about hyper-independence. On the surface, it often masquerades as strength, an iron will, a refusal to rely on anyone, a hardened self-sufficiency. But if you trace it back, if you peel away the surface and ask where that need came from, you'll often find that it wasn't born out of confidence. It was born out of betrayal. When someone learns early on that asking for help leads to disappointment, or that showing vulnerability invites exploitation, they adapt, they armor up, they build a psychological fortress that says, I'll do it myself because I can't afford not to. And it works for a time. It gets them through. They become competent, high-functioning, even admired. People call them impressive, strong, reliable. But what most don't see is the emotional cost of that kind of survival, because hyper-independence isn't freedom. It's a reaction. It's the behavioral echo of emotional neglect or abandonment or chronic invalidation. It's what happens when trust has been broken so many times that the very idea of dependence becomes threatening, not just uncomfortable. It feels like vulnerability that could be weaponized again. And so the individual resolves, often unconsciously, never to let that happen again. But here's the paradox. While hyper-independence feels like protection, it often results in isolation. You may avoid the pain of betrayal, but you also forfeit the nourishment of connection. You keep everyone at arm's length, including those who might genuinely care. And over time, that becomes a kind of prison, a well-furnished, high-functioning, solitary prison. What complicates this even further is that our culture often rewards this trait. We idolize self-made people. We celebrate resilience, grit, individualism. And yes, those are virtues, but not when they come at the expense of relationship, intimacy, and the ability to be seen. Not when they become a mask to hide the belief, if I need you, I'm unsafe. At the core of hyper-independence is a wound around trust, not just the trust of others, but often the trust in oneself. Because if your early experiences taught you that you can't rely on the people who were supposed to show up for you, then somewhere deep inside you also begin to doubt your own perceptions, your own worth. And when that happens, You don't just stop trusting others. You stop trusting your instincts, your feelings, your needs. So you shut them down. You convince yourself you don't need help. You suppress the ache for closeness. You dismiss the longing to be held or understood. But those needs don't go away, they simply go underground. And from there they manifest as resentment, burnout, or a subtle but persistent emptiness, the kind of hollowness that success can't fix, that competence can't soothe. Now, this isn't a condemnation of strength. Strength is good. Strength is good. Autonomy is good. The ability to handle your life is essential. But strength that emerges from avoidance, strength built as a wall to keep out pain, is brittle. It doesn't bend. And what doesn't bend eventually breaks. The alternative is risk, emotional risk. The willingness to experiment with trust again despite your history. That doesn't mean throwing open the gates to anyone and everyone. It means selectively, cautiously, but courageously allowing people to earn your trust and allowing yourself to receive it. That's a terrifying proposition for someone who's been deeply hurt, but it's also the only path to healing, because what trauma breaks, connection, can only be healed through connection. There's a certain kind of dignity in saying I've been hurt and I've survived, but I refuse to let that hurt define the limits of my life. That's not weakness. That's not dependence. That's wholeness. That's integration. And that's the kind of strength that can hold not only your own weight, but also make room for the weight of others. Hyper-independence is a brilliant adaptation. It's the mind's way of saying, I will not be broken again. But at some point, adaptation has to give way to evolution. Because if you stay in that state too long, you begin to mistake survival for fulfillment. And life isn't meant to be endured. It's meant to be lived fully, richly, vulnerably. So the question becomes, what would it look like to trust again, just a little? Not blindly, not foolishly, but wisely, slowly, intentionally. What if you didn't have to carry it all alone? What if the strength wasn't in isolation, but in interdependence? In learning that there is power in connection and grace in asking for help is asking for help, not because you're broken, but because you're human. We were not meant to do this alone. And the most courageous thing you may ever do is to admit that and to let someone in. Survival builds walls. Healing builds bridges. Let today be the day you choose to build one. You'll often notice something interesting about people who've been deeply hurt. They pay attention to everything. The room, your tone, the pause in your voice, the shift in your eyes. They read between the lines and sometimes beyond them. To an outsider, it might look like overthinking or even paranoia. But if you understand trauma, emotional trauma in particular, you begin to see it for what it really is. A defense mechanism forged in fire. When someone has been repeatedly hurt, dismissed, betrayed, or ignored, their nervous system learns a lesson that doesn't go away easily. The world isn't safe. More precisely, a connection isn't safe. And if the people who were supposed to care for you ended up being the ones who hurt you, then your mind learns something even more tragic, that love is a threat. So you adapt. You don't become less sensitive. You become more sensitive, hyper-aware, scanning constantly for danger, even in the places where safety should exist. That's what this keynote is about. It's about the deeply hurt, the people who read too much into things not because they're weak or dramatic or irrational, but because they had to become exceptionally good at spotting threat. And now, they can't not do it. They are the ones who notice when someone's smile doesn't reach their eyes. They catch the moment someone goes quiet or too loud. They hear what you meant, not just what you said. Because for them, these tiny signals used to mean everything. In psychology, we call this hypervigilance. It's a survival strategy, not a personality flaw. But let's be very clear. Survival strategies have costs. Yes, they keep you safe, but they also keep you guarded. They make it hard to relax, hard to trust, hard to feel joy, because you're always waiting for the other shoe to drop. You're not living in the moment. You're scanning it. You're analyzing it. You're preparing for disappointment before it can land. And here's where it gets even more painful. Most people won't understand this about you. They'll call you too sensitive, weak. They'll say you're up projecting or reading too much into it, without realizing that this sensitivity is precisely what helped you survive. They don't see that your nervous system has been on high alert for years, maybe decades. They don't know what it's like to sit in a room and track every shift in tone like your safety depends on it. Because at one point it did. Now, there's a deep philosophical tension here. Because on the one hand, you had to become this way. Your body and mind adapted brilliantly. But on the other hand, if you want to grow beyond your pain, if you want more than survival, if you want freedom, then you'll have to confront the fact that your defenses are now the very thing holding you back. You can't selectively numb perception. If you stay hyper-aware of threat, you also become blind to grace. If you only trust your fear, you lose your ability to respond to beauty, to love, to real good connection. That doesn't mean your sensitivity is wrong. It means it needs to be retrained. Because what used to be protection is now self-sabotage. Between a true red flag and your body reacting to something that feels familiar but isn't actually a threat, that takes work. And not just intellectual work, emotional, somatic, relational work. It means learning to pause and ask, is this about right now, or is this about back then? That question, simple as it is, can change your life. It draws a line between the past and the present. It reminds you that you're not that helpless child anymore. You have choices now. You can observe your fear without obeying it. You can sit with your discomfort instead of reacting to it. And in doing so, you build something most people don't talk about: emotional sovereignty. The ability to trust your perceptions and challenge them, to listen to your intuition without letting it be hijacked by trauma. People who've been deeply hurt often grow into extraordinary human beings. Empathetic, insightful, intuitive, but only if they don't let their pain crystallize into identity. Pain isn't who you are, it's where you've been. And when you start to heal, when you build enough safety internally and externally, something beautiful happens. You begin to relax. You begin to interpret less. You stop trying to read into everything, not because you've grown numb, but because you've grown wise. You learn that not every silence is rejection. Not every delayed response is abandonment. Not every moment of tension means someone is going to hurt you. Sometimes people are just tired or distracted or human. And that realization, subtle as it is the beginning of freedom. It means your nervous system no longer has to fight ghosts. It means you're finally living here now. And that's what we're aiming for. And that's what we're aiming for. Not perfection, not obliviousness, but a grounded, resilient sensitivity that honors the pain of the past without letting it dominate the present. When pain teaches you to look for danger in everything, healing is learning to see peace again. Choose peace, even when it feels unfamiliar, especially then. One of the most quietly tragic effects of deep emotional pain is that it robs you of your ability to fully experience joy. And not because joy isn't available, but because you no longer trust it. It's an experience laced with fear. You don't relax into it. You brace. You wait. You prepare for the moment it disappears, because somewhere along the way, your nervous system internalized a painful rule. Good things don't last. Not for you. Let's be honest about something that doesn't get talked about. Enough. When people go through repeated emotional injuries, abandonment, betrayal, loss, they often develop a deep-seated suspicion of happiness. It's not always conscious. Not like they walk around saying, I can't enjoy this. But there's a subtle resistance holding back. A quiet recoil at the threshold of joy, as if stepping into it too fully would tempt fate to rip it away. And often this belief has been reinforced by experience. You see this in people who've lived through inconsistency, especially in childhood. Maybe they had moments of real love, affection, even celebration, but then it was followed by punishment or neglect or abandonment. The human brain doesn't just remember events, it remembers patterns. in the member's pattern. And if the pattern was, every time I felt safe, it was followed by hurt, then safety itself becomes unsafe. Pleasure becomes threatening. And joy becomes dangerous. That's what trauma does. It teaches your body to fear what should be good. So the fall doesn't feel so very intelligent survival strategy. The body's trying to prevent future pain by dampening the highs, so the fall doesn't feel so devastating. It's trying to prepare. And that preparation is rooted in fear, not because you're weak, but because fear once served you well. But here's the problem. It keeps serving you long after it's needed. Like an old alarm that never turns off. You start to notice it in the small things. You get good news, and instead of celebration, you feel numbness or anxiety. You fall in love, and a part of you is already mourning its end. You laugh with friends, and something in the back of your mind whispers, this won't last. The more joy you touch, the more fear it activates. And this creates a deep emotional dissonance. You want to be happy, but you can't fully allow it. You want to trust life, but you keep rehearsing the worst case scenario. This is not mere pessimism. It's the emotional residue of disappointment layered over time. And the deeper the wound, the more joy feels like a setup. So people cope. Some withdraw from pleasure altogether. Others chase it compulsively, trying to control it before it disappears. But both responses are rooted in the same core fear, that joy is a trap. Now here's where it becomes truly tragic. When people stop trusting joy, they stop creating space for it. They avoid the vulnerability of hope. They lower their expectations to protect themselves. But hope, genuine, courageous hope, isn't naive. It's a risk, yes, but it's a necessary one. Because without hope, you don't build, you don't reach, you don't heal. The philosopher Nietzsche once said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." But the reverse is also true. When you lose your sense of why, the how becomes unbearable. And joy is one of the few whys that make life worth all the effort. Not shallow happiness, not the kind that comes from a dopamine hit or a fleeting distraction. I'm talking about deep joy. The kind rooted in meaning, love, connection, creativity, service, the joy of showing up fully, of giving yourself permission to be whole despite what's been broken. But this kind of joy demands something radical, trust. It asks you to stay open, even though life has hurt you. It asks you to risk knowing you could lose, and that's terrifying. It's also liberating, because when you stop bracing for the fall, you finally allow yourself to rise. And here's a psychological truth that may sound counterintuitive. Allowing yourself to feel joy in the present doesn't increase your risk of future pain. It actually strengthens your capacity to handle it. Why? Because joy is a resource. It builds resilience. It builds resilience. It reminds you that life has more to offer than suffering, and that memory, that internal proof, is what keeps you going when the hard times come again, which they will. But you'll be stronger. Not because you're braced for it, but because you're resourced for it. So how do you begin to trust joy again? Start small. Stay present. When you feel joy creeping in, don't immediately question it. Don't try to cage it with logic or chase it away with fear. Just notice it. Sit with it. Let it grow. Joy doesn't need to be grand to be transformative. Even a moment of stillness, of laughter, of peace is enough to start the rewiring process. Enough to teach your nervous system, maybe this time is different. And if it helps, remind yourself of this. You are not the same person you were when the pain first came. You've grown, you've learned. You have tools now. You have language for what happened to you. That means the next time joy knocks, you don't have to slam the door out of fear. You can open it slowly, cautiously, yes, but open it nonetheless. Joy is not a betrayal of your pain. It's the next chapter. Let it in, not because it's permanent, but because you are worth experiencing it while it lasts. One of the most profound consequences of emotional wounding is that it teaches you to read the unsaid, and not just in a superficial sense. I mean deeply. People who've been hurt, really hurt, develop a kind of psychological sonar. They learn to tune into the invisible. They start picking up on tone shifts, pauses, eye movement, body language. Not because they're nosy, not because they're overly sensitive, but because they had to. There's a peculiar thing that happens when you grow up in an emotionally unpredictable environment. Maybe it was a home where tension lingered in the air like smoke. No visible flames, but the smell of something always burning. Or maybe it was a relationship where the truth was never really said, only hinted at, weaponized, or withheld. In environments like this, people adapt by developing a hyper-attuned sense to the implicit. This ability, this skill of reading the silent spaces between words, is born of necessity. If a parent walked into the room and said nothing, you didn't relax, you analyzed. Were they quiet because they were tired, angry, depressed? Was something coming? What wasn't being said told you more than anything they could have expressed out loud. And so silence, which should have been neutral or even peaceful, became loaded. It became a terrain of meaning to be deciphered, a puzzle to solve for your own safety. What's fascinating is that the child who learns to decode this hidden language often becomes the adult who sees what others miss. They can walk into a room and sense tension that no one else acknowledges. They can sit in a conversation and feel the undertones that never make it into words. They're fluent in the dialect of discomfort, in the pauses, the swallowed sentences, the subtle withdrawal of energy. Now, to outsiders, this can look like intuition, and in many ways it is, but it's not mystical. It's learned. It's learned. It's the byproduct of navigating a world where the unspoken was often more dangerous than the spoken. And here's the kicker. This sensitivity is both a strength and a weight. It gives you an incredible perceptive edge, but it also makes silence emotionally expensive. For someone who's been deeply hurt, silence can feel like rejection. It can feel like punishment, like abandonment. Because historically, silence didn't mean peace. It meant something was wrong. Something was about to break. So even when the present moment is safe, the body remembers the past, and it reacts accordingly. This is trauma memory. It's not a story you consciously repeat. It's a pattern that lives in your nervous system. People like this, people fluent in silence, often find themselves exhausted by social interactions that others find ordinary. It's not just the words they're responding to, it's the whole field. Every subtle cue, every facial twitch, every change in tone is data, and they're analyzing it not to be difficult, but to survive. That's how they've kept themselves safe. And yet, this same skill can make healthy relationships challenging, because not every silence is a threat. Not every pause hides a dagger. Sometimes people are just quiet. Sometimes they need space. Sometimes there's nothing lurking beneath the surface. But when your past has trained you to expect danger in the quiet, neutrality itself becomes suspicious. Peace feels alien. So what's the path forward? It starts with awareness, recognizing that your gift of perception was shaped by pain, but it doesn't need to be governed by it. That your ability to read silence isn't something to discard, but something to redeem. Because there's a difference between using that skill to protect yourself from harm and using it to build deeper, more attuned connections. There's a need to retrain your body, to let it learn, slowly, that not all silences are threats, that presence can exist without performance. That safety can exist without noise, and that peace, real peace, isn't the absence of conflict, it's the absence of fear. Psychologically speaking, healing this kind of wound involves repatterning. You expose yourself bit by bit to safe silence. You sit in the quiet and let your body learn that it won't be punished for relaxing. You enter conversations and remind yourself that you don't need to decode everything. That you're allowed to trust people to speak their truth. And if they don't, it's not your job to fill in the blanks with self-blame. There's something profoundly noble about the individual who turns this pattern inward, not to become more guarded, but to become more free. Because when you stop carrying the burden of decoding everyone else's silence, you get to hear your own voice more clearly. And that voice, that authentic, unfiltered expression of your inner world, is what the pain was always trying to silence in the first place. The paradox is this: those who've been trained by silence are often the ones with the most to say, but they've spent so long translating others that they forget to speak for themselves. Healing means reclaiming that voice, not to scream, not to overcompensate, but to exist confidently, audibly, unapologetically. So if you're someone who's learned to read silence like a second language, take this as your reminder. You don't have to keep interpreting everyone else's silence. Let people speak for themselves. Let the quiet be quiet. Be quiet. And allow yourself, finally, to rest in the sound of your own truth. Silence once wounded you, but now it can be the space where your voice finally echoes back.